Hello, my name is Teresa Barnes. I am the director of DuraMAT, and I want to wish you all a very happy fiscal new year as we honor the October 1st New Year around the federal laboratory complex and the new DuraMAT funding cycle for the next 6 years. And thank you for attending our October DuraMAT webinar. We have these monthly on a variety of topics. And the purpose of these webinars is to provide you all, our DuraMAT community, with information about DuraMAT work and other topics that influence and inform DuraMAT work. If you are interested in finding out more about DuraMAT and our research portfolio and ways to get involved, please visit our website at www.duramat.org. And make sure you join us next month for that webinar that Harrison mentioned on CAST testing of PV modules and BOS components with Peter and David. Our speaker today is Dr. David Fenning. He is an associate professor of nanoengineering at UC San Diego, where he's directed the Solar Energy Innovation Laboratory. He completed his BS at Stanford in 2008 and his PhD from MIT in mechanical engineering in 2013, and worked briefly with 1366, the direct wafer folks, before joining UC San Diego in 2015. His research focuses on defect engineering to improve performance and reliability in silicon and hybrid perovskite solar cells and modules. And he specializes in advanced characterization of solar PV and solar to fuels technologies. David has partnered on a DuraMAT funded project with Arizona State University studying the effects of viscoelasticity on PV module durability using in situ mapping of deformation. And today he's going to talk about the effects of moisture and temperature on the deflection of encapsulated cells. And so with that, I'll hand over to Professor Fenning. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And thank you all for joining. And thank you, Teresa and Laura, for the opportunity to talk a little bit about our project and our component of it, especially focusing on the intersection of moisture and stress in silicon modules. So as mentioned, this is a collaborative project in DuraMAT led by Professor Mariana Bertoni at Arizona State in conjunction with researchers at DuPont and supported on the modeling side by Sandia National Laboratory. As a component of DuraMAT, what we're really after are linking the design variables that we have in establishing our modules, whether it's the cell architecture that we choose, especially focusing on the bill of materials in DuraMAT, and how that relates to the global performance degradation over time. So let's see, let me make sure you can see my laser pointer. In general, we're doing this as a community via observation after extended outdoor operation, or especially via accelerated testing. And the challenge, of course, is that the degradation pathways, whether it's delamination or cracking, corrosion, they're sensitive to the particular stressors seen by any given module in processing, but also in the environment. And of course, the underlying bill of materials. And so what we're focused on providing is, and our goal is to provide new tools to link degradation globally and locally back to underlying physical mechanisms. So Arizona State, led by Mariana Bertoni, has established a very nice tool using Xray topography to understand the stress and deflection within modules. My team has developed a non-contact optical approach to measure moisture within modules. I'll talk a little, which we call WARD. We'll talk a little bit about how that works and how we're applying it today. And then another tool, which I won't be focusing on today, but which my group has been developing, is to quantify and track mobile ions as they drift across, especially the dielectric layers, causing degradation such as PID. This uses flatband monitoring. I just refer you to one of our recent works on that. So today, be focusing on the interplay between stress and moisture within modules, with the ultimate goal being to connect this via differing levels of modeling, whether it's finite element, using the computational expertise of a team like Sandia's, or data-driven models as are being actively pursued within DuraMAT and beyond, in order to invert this design process. Right now, there's a proliferation of architectures and technologies in the industry. There's lots of questions as to how this forward problem proceeds, right? how can we really expect these to last? How can we best develop new accelerated stress tests in order to identify weaknesses? Ultimately, the dream would be to say, we would like to establish, the most cost-effective means to get a particular degradation rate, right? So by pairing these new tools that provide local information with modeling, we hope to be able to then invert the problem and work with industry to specify their materials and designs, and to design them in order to achieve a particular degradation rate. So that's the vision. Today we'll be talking about the piece of the puzzle involving viscoelasticity and the stress and moisture within modules. So first, I'd like to take the opportunities to presenting today to talk about our development of water reflectometry detection and its application in silicon PV. And then I'll highlight how we've studied glass-glass versus glass backsheet modules, looking at water as one of the kind of key reactants or a possible reactant in determining failure. Now let's switch gears a little bit to talk about the measurement of deflection and stress with an example on interconnects before kind of connecting the two, water and stress, as we look at half-cut 9-bus bar mini modules that kind of really represent one direction that the industry is moving. So first, a little bit of background on our measurement technique to quantify water in modules. So the idea is that ideally we would know, as a function of stress testing or outdoor testing, how our modules really interacting with the environment. And so we can do this by a front side optical measurement that operates in the shortwave infrared, where there is overtone and combination mode absorption from vibrational modes of water molecules, but where the module components have a relatively flat baseline. Our absorbers are generally have fallen off in their band gap. They're not strongly absorbing. And the glass absorption generally doesn't pick up until farther out in the IR. So by focusing on this higher order vibrational mode, we actually develop a sensitivity to the moisture within the module. The way this kind of looks is that in a typical, say, monofacial cell, we're passing through the glass. There's relatively little absorption and it's very broad band, it's flat. We pass through the cell and one layer of the encapsulant. The encapsulant can contain water. Water has a quite high absorption coefficient at these wavelengths due to the particular vibrational mode. And so we can be quite sensitive to it above the background. And so from this, and then the reflection off of either a back surface field or the rear dielectric layer in a more advanced architecture, we can measure the absorption within the encapsulant, for example, EVA, by a simple Beer's law calculation where the absorption is proportional to the absorbance is proportional to the concentration of moisture present. The challenge that would be posed would be in determining the path length in a particular module, since we know that the EVA, for example, is not especially flat. There's also deflections that we'll talk about later. So in order to take care of this, we use a ratio of absorbances, accounting for the backbone absorptions of the EVA so that we are independent of the path length. This allows us to have a signal that is proportional only to the infrared signature of moisture. So with this, in previous work supported by the CETO office, we developed calibration curves for PERC and ALBSF modules with using EVA 9100, and showed that we could establish a very precise measurement of the moisture concentration in mini modules for a range of concentrations from the standard 85 damp heat all the way down to vanishingly small moisture concentrations, like Atacama desert style concentrations. So spanning the terrestrial range and accelerated tests. So this was originally developed for EVA, but the principles of the technique are generalizable. So we're relying on a water combination band and a CH stretch. And so encapsulants like POE or TPOs can be measured as well. We are now under the current DuraMAT project exploring especially POEs, and we see that in our establishing the saturation water content of our EVA as compared with of POE as compared with EVA, we do of course have much less water under saturation conditions. And this sort of shrinks down the range over which we are measuring our word signal. But we do have still quite good detection signal noise down to very low water concentrations. So some of the things we can do include not just a steady state measurement of how much water is present, but we can also, for example, track the out diffusion of moisture from exposed layers to measure the diffusivity of moisture in, say, an EVA, as shown here, extracting it using simple one-dimensional models. And we'll see later that we are, currently very interested in this out diffusion problem, particularly in the backside of glass backsheet modules. So this is something that we can follow as well. Just for the sake of the community here who's assembled, it's a nice opportunity to talk about some of the sort of finer points and interesting things that we saw. So when we were pulling our modules out, mini modules out of 8585 damp heat, that were saturated. So they've been in for several weeks, more like a damp heat 1000 test. When we pull those out, there is more water within the polymer than the saturation content at room temperature. And so if we go immediately from that damp heat environment to any kind of optical testing, we see a flatlining that reflects the condensation of moisture within the mini module. That's in agreement with the saturation water content at room temperature. So this is a reversible process. So we can dry it back out and heat it back up, and that condensation will go away. And this was most evident if we illuminated it edge on, so as to see the actual droplets of water that were forming within the mini module. I just wanted to share that a little bit because a lot of testing can happen upon removing from damp heat, and it's something to be aware of that may affect optical measurements. We're also interested in exploring the application of this water reflectometry to other absorbers. We're not necessarily specific to silicon. What we require is a shortwave infrared window based upon the components of the cell and module, and some kind of square reflectance to get our signal back out to the front side. But we can, in principle, do it in transmission as well. And so we are interested in the hybrid perovskite solar cells and modules as well, and the application there. This is something that we're currently exploring. So overall, this WAR technique enables a quantitative in situ measurement of a module water content. Our detection limit in EVA is something about 16.6 part per million. And this allows us to span all relevant terrestrial conditions and 85 damp heat testing. You can perform this using relatively standard benchtop hardware, a UV-Vis near-IR spectrophotometer that goes, if it goes out to that 1900 nanometer mode. We have since established it using a tunable laser out in the shortwave IR that allows us to then map cells and modules so that we can focus the beam down arbitrarily, in principle down to the diffraction limit, a couple microns in size, and map across fingers, bus bars, near junction boxes and so on, in order to understand non-uniformities within the module. Today, I'll be talking about these as applied to silicon modules with EVA and POE, but the concept is extensible to other absorbers and encapsulants. So with that, I want to talk about our application of this infrared reflectometry to glass and glass backsheet modules. This was a sort of tour de force amongst some of the junior researchers on my team with spanning a lot of measurements. Here we're using aluminum back surface field modules. They're all EVA, and we were interested in a longitudinal study of how water was affecting these modules. We packaged some with glass and some as glass backsheet, and we exposed them to 3 different temperatures, 25, 65, and 85 C, and 3 different relative humidities, dry, and basically in the glove box, so 0% relative humidity, 85% relative humidity to capture that typical 85, and a lower relative humidity around 65% relative, so that we had a range of humidities and temperatures and absolute water concentrations. Over time, we monitored the photoluminescence IV in order to parameterize local cell parameters as a function of the local water concentration. So what this looked like was a span of water concentrations within the module, including the damp heat test, but also finer steps in absolute water concentration and intermediate temperature as well, so as to allow us to basically build a response curve, a response surface of water and temperature effects. We arrayed the the glass and glass backsheet across these conditions, and then monitored them over time using the PLIV, which varies the illumination intensity and the forward bias voltage in order to extract cell parameters locally, and then a mapping ward in order to look at local water content. This, across all these environments and package types, led to really an amazing data problem. We had 70 mini module samples that we exposed with 2 different architectures across these 7 temperatures and humidities. Over this longitudinal study of 2,500 hours of damp heat, we made roughly 1,000 individual measurements of the performance and water content. Just summing it all up, that led to something like 10 million points in water and time space, and 7 billion PLIV pixels to analyze, and really benefited from a much larger team here at UCSD, including some undergraduate researchers who really contributed a lot and are co-authoring with us on the study. To summarize, we basically saw 2 dominant modes of power loss in these glass and glass backsheet models. We saw power loss from finger interruptions that was evident in electroluminescence imaging. And if we automatically detected these areas, thresholded them, we could remove those effects and study also the background series resistance rise that occurred over time. So I'll break down the following discussion to analyzing the effects leading to finger interruptions and the severity between glass and glass backsheet, and then move to background series resistance. So the first conclusion was that we saw glass mini modules showing finger interrupts earlier than glass backsheet. So these are cumulative distribution functions on the time of interrupt formation across the temperature and relative humidity range. And so glass shown in green relatively consistently showed more interrupts earlier. And we can reduce that data down to look at when, over time, the mean time to failure for a glass backsheet versus a glass sample, the mean time to interrupt formation. And what we saw is that basically, as you go to higher temperatures and higher relative humidities, that actually glass backsheet modules were favored, with interrupt formation times hundreds of hours later than would be typical of a glass module. The results were statistically significant, particularly for the variation with temperature. So temperature severely affected our glass mini modules, with interrupts forming earlier than they would in glass backsheet modules. The locations of these interrupts was also telling. The glass interruption, if we just look at the location with red with dots indicating the particular location of finger breakage, these interrupts form more commonly near the bus bar in our glass-glass mini modules, and then away from the bus bar in the glass backsheet. And this is consistent with parallel work going on at Arizona State, where they were studying the stress distributions in these two kinds of modules, and where they saw higher bending stresses in glass-glass modules arising during the lamination process. So in contrast, the glass backsheet modules interrupt in drier locations. So if we compare the local water content and the location of the finger interrupts, the glass backsheet modules consistently fell off of a one-to-one line, where the one-to-one line shows the local water concentration where that finger is breaking compared to the average over the cell. Glass were not statistically significantly different from the one-to-one, but glass backsheet modules were showing breaks where the module was drier. And this was actually really pretty interesting to us, this local water concentration and not the cumulative water exposure was really what was mattering in these glass backsheet modules. In order to try and understand the mechanism by which these finger interrupts were occurring, we used high resolution electroluminescence and identified mechanical cracks at many of the locations where we saw finger interrupts, although not all. In order to try and further rule out corrosion mechanism, Arizona State and April Jeffries in particular performed some very nice Raman analysis of products of corrosion reactions, where over time we did not see this silicate peak decreasing, nor this product of reaction increasing in blue. So basically we had a null result, suggesting that in modern paste, corrosion is not a principal cause of these finger interrupts forming. Turning over to the background series resistance, which affects the rest of the cell, excluding the interrupt regions, we still see series resistance increases. And here, glass-glass modules are favored. So looking at the mean change in the series resistance over the longitudinal study, we saw that glass backsheet modules had higher series resistances on average at the end, higher background series resistances than glass-glass. And this was really, maybe not tremendously surprising in a way. We know that one of the ideas behind glass-glass is that we're protecting the cell more extensively from moisture ingress. But here, we are able to separate these mechanisms of power loss, and in order to identify particular environments where one or the other architecture may be more favorable for operation. So tracking the power loss over time in the glass-glass versus glass backsheet, we have the darkest curve showing the net effect, and then the solid lines showing the effect of finger interrupts and breakages, and the dotted lines showing the background RS. It is a little bit tangled here, and so I wanted to break down, because in the end, the performance differs, and what module we might choose differs depending upon the environment. So finger interrupts, as I mentioned, are a bigger issue in glass-glass, and it's particularly a problem at higher temperatures. But the background series resistance becomes really a problem for glass backsheet as we go to higher temperatures and relative humidities. So there are circumstances, particularly high temperature and relative humidity, where glass-glass becomes better, where in drier environments, the glass backsheet can be better. So to put it in terms of combined power loss, the glass-glass performance is limited by interrupts at lower temperature and relative humidities. And those conditions might be better served according to our study by selection of glass backsheet modules. But where the glass backsheet actually start to really shine compared to glass-glass are for higher temperatures and relative humidities. So in conclusion, to summarize this study where we combined PLIV local imaging of performance with local water content imaging by ward, we saw that glass mini modules crack earlier and near the bus bar. And this is sort of maybe straightforwardly a result of the two rigid sides and the high stresses that can arise at bus bar in this rigid module format. Interestingly, the glass backsheet cracked earlier in drier environments, which is consistent with some recent environmental studies of the modulus of encapsulants by Nick Bosco and colleagues, showing that the backsheet and EVAs will soften at higher water contents, the backsheet especially. So the glass backsheet is rather more flexible in higher humidities, but the glass backsheet suffers a unique backside series resistance loss at these higher humidities as well. So we want to choose carefully depending upon the environment where our module may be deployed. So it's an example of how we're applying this local water imaging. I want to try to change gears a little bit and take a look at measuring deflection and stress in mini modules here with an example on interconnects, and then we'll pair the two together. So the Bertoni group at Arizona State has developed Xray topography technique where a mini module is rotated through the Bragg condition on a motorized stage. As the module is rotated, the location of the crystal within the mini module as a function of position can be extracted from the Bragg diffraction that you're seeing in the detector on the right-hand side. So by extracting the angle at which the diffraction occurs, then rotating the module so that you can have the two components of curvature, using von Karman plate theory or finite element analysis can recover the stress state of the mini module of the silicon cell that gives rise to the deflection that's observed. The von Karman plate theory actually applies quite well here because of the thinness of the cell and the relatively small gradients in deflection, although they do appear more concentrated, especially near the bus bars. So we can now analyze in sort of wonderful glory the effect of different interconnection schemes on the mechanical stress within modules. Here's an example showing bifacial cells, in one case with 4 bus bars and a full cell, and then in the other case with a half-cut cell with 9 bus bars. And another important difference is that the interconnection uses a flat wire in the full cell mini module, while it uses a round wire in the half-cut cells. If we take a look at the deflection images, the most prominent deflections are seen around those 4 bus bars in that module, and that's where the stresses are really concentrated. Here, the x-axis component of the stress, and here the y-axis. So you can see that basically we have a strong bending near each of these bus bars. In the half-cut mini module, there's a really large deflection right in the neighborhood of the half-cut. And in addition, high stresses along each of those small 9 bus bars. To look more closely, we can look at the distribution of stresses in the neighborhood of the edges and in the neighborhood of the bus bars themselves and the ribbons. So in general, the 9 bus bar cell ends up having higher deflections, particularly at its edges. The 9 bus bar cell, on the other hand, also shows higher stresses in the neighborhood of those 9 bus bars, indicated by the higher bars on the histogram at higher stresses. So this was a little bit unexpected in that, much of the motivation for going to more and more bus bars is trying to, of course, take care of current collection, but also with an idea toward minimizing stresses. But if we look at the top 0.1% of stresses within the module, we see that the 9 bus bar actually ends up with much higher stresses than the 4 bus bar mini module. So we hypothesize that some of this may be arising due to the use of the round wire in the 9 bus bar assembly, as opposed to the flat wire in the 4 bus bar assembly. So I think one of the challenges that we're kind of all working through is aligning all of these experiments as the module architectures are changing really quite rapidly. We're trying to kind of stay up to date and using the newest module materials. I think really, trying to identify mechanisms will require us to perform additional and more tightly controlled experiments on this bill of materials, and hopefully, really engaging our industrial partners for the provision of these as best as possible, really to try and encourage them to focus on the scientific upside through the careful experimentation. So with these stress and deflection data, in order to try and identify, is it really that round versus flat wire, for example, how are these stresses arising? We are working with Sandia National Lab in order to try and understand these effects. They are producing master curves of the modulus of the encapsulants that we are using, and generally are found to be in pretty good agreement with those measured by Bosco and colleagues, and implementing them into finite element modules where we're trying to fully capture the relevant time dependence and temperature dependence of the lamination and module encapsulation. In order to incorporate the effect of moisture in a fielded application, we are now working on integrating sort of all of the above, right? Our ward measurement of local water content and the effect on the deflection and stress. We focused on these 9 bus bar half-cut bifacial cells as really representing a kind of state-of-the-art and one direction where we see a lot of industry motion. These are, it's really great to work with the latest and greatest, but they always do present new challenges. But we're using kind of the cross-validation between sites in our project in order to try and understand the whole picture. So we receive these mini modules and then initialize our experiments by first drying them out. As received, they tend to show a rather wide variation in moisture content because the conditions on the day of lamination can vary at the site, and therefore the laminate itself will have differing water concentration that then can be locked in by that front side glass. So first we dry them out, and we can verify with Ward when dry out is sort of fully complete, and then use Ward to track water uptake during subsequent accelerated tests. The bifaciality presents an interesting challenge to this Ward technique. Previously with PERC or monofacial PERC or ALBSF, we have a complete rear side reflector. In this case, we have both signal from the reflectance, whether we measure from the front or the backside of the bifacial cell, but we also transmit IR light. And this means that we do pick up signal from the backside of our mini module, even when we're measuring from the front for the bifacial cell. So we have performed transfer matrix method modeling, including both the coherent and incoherent interfaces, in order to try and understand which one, where our signal is arising from. we still see most of the reflection occurring at that backside dielectric interface. And so the predominant signal in a front side measurement or a backside measurement will come from the closer of the two EVAs or encapsulants. So we've started these experiments looking at dry modules. If we look at the room temperature deflection and compare it with the 85C deflection, we see in general that the extremes of color in this 85°C deflection map are relatively reduced. Some of this deflection distribution has sort of narrowed. We can also take a look at the difference map to see where this has occurred. And we can see that actually some of this is occurring periodically, arising from those bus bars. I'd note that the red colors indicates a deflection toward the glass, and the blue color a deflection away from the glass or toward the backsheet in these glass backsheet modules. So in order to try and visualize this better, we can take just a quadrant of the module, since we measure actually in 4 pieces at a time in the X-ray topography, and look at the distribution dry and at room temperature, and then again at 85C. And we've done a linear interpolation between these two maps of deflection in order to try and visualize just a straight line interpolation to visualize how the deflection is changing and where. So we have at the top here a histogram of the changing deflection, and then here a spatial map of this changing deflection as we're effectively raising the temperature. I want to emphasize we don't have this data in situ during the temperature change, but this is just visualizing the interpolation between the endpoints. So what we can see in terms of the distribution is that although some of the distribution is broadening here, the most extreme components are decreasing in number. And so overall, there appears to be a significant shift in the distribution toward the glass during heating, but a reduction in that long tail of the distribution that leads to an overall lower variation. If we look at the stresses, so from deflection using modeling, mechanical modeling to move to stresses, the initial stress is heavily concentrated around those bus bars as mentioned previously. And as we go to 85°C, we actually see quite a bit lower stress around many of the bus bars. And so we see that the stress is actually reducing in most cell areas at this high temperature. And we hypothesize that this is arising due to the mechanical softening of the EVA encapsulant as we are raising the temperature to 85°C, where we are no longer able to really transfer stresses to the cell from this now kind of loosey-goosey encapsulant at 85°C. The really interesting part comes as we introduce moisture here. So moving from a dry 85°C condition to a damp heat condition. So we go from this deflection map just shown. We soak the module for about a week, allowing a gradient of water from the sides of the cells to the interior. And as we see, as we measured over time, the difference map is actually rather distinct between each of the 4 quadrants of the cell measured over time. So the last quadrant measured shows the largest changes in deflection, but each of them has its own kind of signature. And what we can quantitatively say from our mini module measurements in our ward setup here at UC San Diego, using the same kind of time temperature profile in the damp heat test and then the exposure to the environment at 85°C for the testing, is that during the X-ray topography, the backside of our cells is drying out through that backsheet. So the ward signal here incorporates initially a contribution of moisture from the front side of the cell where it's completely saturated, and also the backside due to the bifaciality. As we expose it to 85°C, like in the XRT setup, where we cannot introduce humidity, but we want to avoid that condensation effect, so we keep it at 85C, what we see is the moisture within our module drying out over time until we reach a condition where the water concentration is essentially dry on the backside and has a concentration gradient on the front side. We can effectively monitor the egress of water by also looking at this diffusion profile right at the edge of our cell, where over time, as the front side also begins to dry, we can see drying occurring within the first few millimeters of the edges of our cell. So we really were able to track this backside dry out. In part, this is expected through the breathable backsheet, but the diffusivity of this EVA appears to be particularly high. We also established that we do have a front side gradient. In part, we were trying to capture that gradient in order to see its effect. But what we established was that a very complex stress state within our mini module. So we hypothesized that the outdiffusion of water over time leads to really this one-sided swollen EVA on the front that's contributing to deflection. But even during our XRT measurement, water was outdiffusing on the backside, leading to an unequal impact of humidity over time. So we still have sort of work to do, but we can focus on the first quadrant, where this reflects really the initial condition in each case, and should most distinctly reflect the presence of moisture both front and back. And if we start from that 85C stress state, now introduced, 85 dry to 85, what we see in terms of the deflection distribution is a very clear narrowing of the deflection distribution. The largest changes are occurring near the edges of our half-cut cell. These are the edges that would also allow water ingress toward the front. And we know from some of our mechanical measurements and those in the literature that the EVA is softening not just due to the elevated temperature, but additionally due to the ingress of moisture. And so we think that this EVA softening is leading again to a reduction in the transfer of stress. So let's see. How do I? Okay, so to kind of summarize these stress data, when we compare a room temperature map to just a dry condition to adding water to 85, or the combined effect going from room temperature to a damp heat, we see that there's a really rich and complex stress state within our mini modules, indicated by these deflection maps. So there's clearly a dominant role of the interconnections and bus bars. The moisture definitively alters the distribution, and it's most evident along the exposed sides where water ingress was facilitated during the water exposure at damp heat. And ultimately, we have a complex distribution of stressors that we are going to be working to disentangle here over time, in part supported by the viscoelastic modeling from Sandia. So overall, today I shared kind of a wide range and a lot of data knowledge, and I look forward to having the chance to discuss a little bit. But our new tools focus on measuring stress and the local moisture content that we hope will help us establish better models for how our design variables are ultimately leading to particular degradation. Experimentally, looking forward, we are really most focused on looking at conditions under the extremes of accelerated testing. So we are continuing with these damp heat, but then we're also looking at the low temperatures of a thermal cycling test or humidity freeze test. And then beyond that, we're really interested in the introduction of moisture gradients. So a damp heat where it's sitting there may not be most reflective. Of course, thermal cycling has a lot of gradients, but does not necessarily, doesn't have a well-defined moisture content. By combining our ability to measure stress and moisture, we hope to systematically disentangle the gradients within the module and the contributions from moisture separate from the temperature-driven mechanical effects. Just as a little sneak peek, we have done some low temperature measurements at in situ XRT at -40°C. So this involves a room temperature map, a cool down, and then a final room temperature map. And you can see that we have essentially reversible deflections, which is great. And the really interesting stuff arises in comparing the low temperature map from the room temperature map. You can see that there's large deflections that can occur near those bus bars, where again, we hypothesize that the EVA, which is now dramatically stiffened at low temperatures, increases the stress transfer. And so we're the study of the viscoelastic effects here, and including thermal expansion, are underway with Sandia. These stresses can be quite large near the bus bar at these low temperatures. And so this is really a nice illustration of kind of, in part, what we know to be true, but giving us a window in order to improve our design systematically by looking at some of these peak stresses. Another part of our outlook is, I would say, oriented toward the Dataverse across the community in DuraMAT, but also within our team, toward developing predictive design and that inverse design for durability. So we're working on finalizing the finite element modeling with respect to the Xray topography data in order to really be able to extend the finite element modeling to design, say, tight temperature profiles. We're also working on developing correlative models between our stress and moisture and performance data, much like we did in that that moisture and performance study I showed in the first half of the talk, where we hope with the large amount of data to be working toward data-driven models of performance losses. And ultimately, we hope to be moving toward experiments that are occurring computationally. So using the finite element or these data-driven models, what happens if we're changing the 9 bus bar to a flat wire computationally, right? And what do we expect to occur, and how is it changing the stress and ultimately the performance? So hopefully that provides a nice snapshot of kind of what
I'd like to thank you for listening to my talk, and I would like to thank my co-authors and collaborators from Sandia and beyond. In particular, I would like to thank Mariana Bertoni.
Sorry, David, trying to figure out where that's coming from.
And I would like to thank Dr. Meyer, Sara Vishwakarma, Dr. Xiaodong Meng, and Angel de la Rosa for help with measurements and analysis. Funding for this project comes from DuraMAT and the Department of Energy. Thanks again, and I'd be happy to take any of your questions.
Perfect. So that was.
There's always a risk of borrowing slides from students.
Yeah, that was the PVRW acknowledgements, but slightly modified. I need to include my special thanks to some of our colleagues here at UC San Diego, especially the undergraduates who contributed to the PLIB and DAMP testing, and Dr. von Gastro, who's now at SunPower. So with that, I'd like to thank you and take any questions on the effect of moisture and temperature on these silicon modules.
All right, well, let's thank Professor Fenning for a great presentation. We really enjoyed it, learned a lot for sure. As you guys know, standard DuraMAT practice is we put questions into the Q&A tab. I'll go through them as you all put them in there. So the first question is from Henry at DNVGL asking about, I believe, the Ward technique. How do you calibrate that?
Sure. So we use generally just gravimetric measurements of water uptake. So measuring the mass change in pucks of encapsulant, so larger polymers that allow us to look at the saturation water content. Then we turn over, because the amount of polymer within a module is small, and so the mass changes are small. Then we turn it over to an actual cell or module and establish the calibration curve against a known absolute water concentration now, what our Ward signal is here, where the Ward signal is that absorbance peak of water with respect to the CH vibrational mode. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I think so. The second question is also from Henry, and I'm going to ask the two in a row because I think this is one that popped out for a lot of us based on results we've seen throughout DuraMAT. Is generally we expect glass to perform better in damp heat than glass backsheet. So why do you think you're seeing different outcomes, especially in those specific situations where the glass backsheet does appear to perform better?
Yeah, this was a really interesting and somewhat surprising result to us as well. So, I mean, we don't have an edge seal, just to be clear. The main effect that we saw was something that we think is unique to the backside of the cells that we had. So the front side water concentrations, because we don't have any edge seal, are effectively the same for our glass and glass backsheet, right? So any front side effects should be exactly the same. So it's really a backside, and that the dominant losses were in that generalized, global series resistance, which was everywhere. And so it seems like in these mini modules, there was something, perhaps a corrosion reaction occurring actually at the backside, but somehow that backside was deteriorating in the glass backsheet.
Okay, interesting.
So the glass themselves, sorry, I think I twisted around the question. The glass themselves, they were suffering due to cracking. And in part, the cracking was most sensitive to temperature, but also when the EVA was drier. And so the smallest differences were, across that, were resolvable because of that full response surface. So I also think that, some of the result is disentangleable because of the kind of finer meshing, right? Not just comparing an 85 to room temperature.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's a lot going on there that is also kind of difficult to resolve from where the cell and how the cells were made.
Absolutely.
Especially if they were not made on a commercial line. That's something we consistently in DuraMAT see some weird, I don't know how to describe it other than some weird results.
Yeah, and so this is, a recurring theme, right? It's always difficult to really get after the origins of the cells, even, when we know the architecture or working with our industrial partners. But, whether they did something different, it can be hard to tell. So having some kind of validated source or, cells at the ready where people are really willing to contribute cells for kind of round robin throughout the consortium kind of testing as kind of a baseline, it could be really valuable, I think. Yeah,
agreed. Because we're seeing this throughout consortium results, and we're also seeing it with mini modules we're getting fabbed. Because we just don't have a lot of options of places to make them. So I know various places are trying to get better at this, including us, but it's an ongoing challenge. I'm kind of wondering, do you think that factored into the stress results you saw with the 9 bus bar cells that were also kind of counter to expectation a little bit?
Yeah, so in contrast, those mini modules were provided to us. So the assembly of the glass, the small glass and glass backsheet ones, that was done at ASU, where it's sort of a more, and at least at the time was a more manual process, and here, these ones, we know less exactly how they were produced, but, are much closer, I think, to kind of state of the art. But it's a challenge to say that or to rule that out.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to be super clear. I'm not criticizing anybody for having to use homebrewed modules. We are all doing the best we can with what we can get. But I think it's really helpful, especially in kind of an internally-ish facing meeting like this, to make sure we have everything on the table with where we could be seeing artifacts and stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because I think there's something there, and then there's something to being able to use these techniques on commercial modules. Maybe we can compare and learn a lot. So
right.
Thank
Yeah.
you. So the next question is from Sang-Han at UNM. Do you expect the encapsulated volume to reach equilibrium with vapor pressure simply tracking temperature by something like an Antoine equation? During damp heat tests, he suspects moisture increase has a long lag time once the outside RH is fixed.
So eventually, in a damp heat test, the encapsulant appears to reach equilibrium. Of course, depends upon the size of the mini module and when that equilibrium is reached in the center. But even for example, these 8x8 inch mini modules, it's a substantial portion of a damp heat 1000 test in order to reach equilibrium. And so those equilibration times can be quite long.
Right.
So we've done both, basically. In that 2,500 hours of damp heat, those ones are reaching equilibrium on front side. Here in this most recent study comparing moisture and stress within these half-cut cells, we are actually trying to intentionally introduce a gradient. And so we did not allow them to come into equilibrium. Probably one of our next steps will be to have a control arm where we do.
Okay. Cool. So we are coming up on time, so I'm going to give it one last question before we fold up. And this one's coming from Mike DeSegli. Would we expect physical cracks to age with mechanical or thermal cycling rather than sustained dry heat? Or we would expect that. What physical mechanism could be causing non-corrosion grid line interruption due to sustained application of dry heat?
Yeah, this is an important point that we do. So we are removing those mini modules from that sustained dry heat for our measurements. So for those JV tests and PLIV. And we were at the beginning, while we were saturating them, we were removing them every 100 hours because we were really interested in those effects. But we realized that, here we're doing basically a combined thermal cycling test. And so at later times, we spread those out to, I believe, 250 hours. But over the course of that 2,500 hour damp heat or dry heat, as the case may have been, we are thermally cycling it. So it's kind of like a catch-22, right? Where we're trying to get the intermediate data points, and you can't, at least resource-wise, we can't just expend a module once you've damp heat tested it. You take a data point at 1,000 hours, and then kind of toss it out, because we need all the power of the data that we can get. So I think it is a really important point, and I appreciate the question, where essentially embedded, we do have kind of a thermal cycling test. All right. So I'd be happy to try and answer any follow-up. Feel free to email me, and thank you all for your attention.
Yeah, thanks everybody, and thank you, David. Sorry, I just got kicked off for a second as you were finishing answering that question. Please join us in November. We like these webinars to be as interactive as they can be, so please keep coming with the good questions and the good discussion. And we will talk to you all then. Take care.